there is a movement to abolish national debts. There's even a committee called the Committee to Abolish Third World Debt, the debt of Asian, African, Latin American countries, because this debt, in case you're not familiar with it, is an enormous burden. Now think of it this way. In a country in Latin America or Asia or Africa that has borrowed money year after year for a long time to keep itself afloat, to keep the schools open and the hospitals running, as well as to have their military and so on, but they borrow money, they now have to do something that a country without debt doesn't have to do. A country without debt says, okay, we're going to have our people producing these goods and consuming the goods that they produce, more or less. But a country with a debt doesn't do that. It has to produce a bunch of goods, and then before it distributes anything, it has to take a big chunk of what it's produced and hand it back as interest and debt service. Which means as the debts get larger, more and more of the product of a society is not available to its people. The job of the people is to continue to produce it. They have to go to work, but they don't get to consume it because it has to be paid in a debt. Now, often the debts were contracted by dictatorships, by unpopular governments that were not elected, by shenanigans and corruptions of all kinds. So the movement has developed in many third world countries. Why should we now, for the foreseeable future, be stuck with an enormous poverty problem? Not because we're not good at producing. We are. But we can't consume what we're producing because we have to pay debts. Now the situation gets uglier when you discover that the places to which the poor countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America have to pay the debts are to the rich countries. And there's something in most human beings' brains that says, let's see, we got the rich people over here, we got the poor people over there. There's something wrong if the poor people can't consume what they produce in order to send it to where the people already are rich. Something is wrong here. Now, you don't get this in the American newspapers because we are not a poor country. We're at the other side. Yes, ma'am. Oh, exactly the same thing. That's right. Stuck in that same debt-ridden poverty. That's right. So here we have this situation, and in other countries, in Europe and elsewhere, a movement has developed to support an interesting proposition. Abolish the debt. Cancel the debt. Some of you who grew up in religious homes, you know the religious concept, Jubilee. Comes out of the Bible, and I don't know, I can't keep the different religions straight. They get fuzzy in my mind, but anyway, one or more of them have this idea of Jubilee, and it's very old, and the idea goes something like this, that in order to prevent our country from falling apart, our community, which will happen if some people become very rich and the others become very poor, to avoid that, every 20 years, 30 years, it varies by each religion, we kind of, get ready, cancel all the debts. So the poor people who are really laboring under a debt kind of get freed of that, and the rich people discover that what they thought was going to be income coming from the poor isn't coming anymore. Most major religions think this is a great idea. Now, you might not have heard that in your local church, but that's a problem with your minister, not with the religion. Okay? And you might want to talk to him or her about it and make enemies that way. But in any case, and please don't tell them that I told you about this. Not being a regular churchgoer, or for that matter, even irregular, their point is, you want to be careful about this. Anyway, this movement around the world, it has a committee that is now an international organization, the Committee to Abolish Third World Debt. And there's a French economist named Eric Toussaint, Toussant. In English, I don't know how to kill it the way English people do, Toussaint, or something like that, who is a very wonderful economist, writes about this all the time. And he wrote an article recently that I found so arresting that I wanted to tell you a little bit about it as one of our short updates. He poses the following question. The country in Europe that is closest at this moment to actually taking a position of canceling its debt as a principle is Greece. And that's not surprising. Greece has suffered very badly in the current crisis, and the political party in Greece, called the Syriza party, is now winning the votes. That is, the polling indicates that if there were election this week or next week, they would win. And under Greek law, if you're not familiar with it, whatever party comes in first gets the number of seats in parliament not only equal to their percentage of the popular vote, all parties get that many seats, but the party that comes in first gets a bonus, an additional 50 seats. That's why the current government, whose largest party is a conservative party, is able to be the government, even though a minority of the Greek people voted for that party and the parties it's in coalition with. So you have a minority government because of this peculiar rule that the party that comes in first gets extra seats. Of course, that rule was keeping the left down. The great problem now is if the left wins that election, then this law meant to destroy the left will allow the left to play that game with everybody else. And one of the positions that the leader of the Greek Syriza party, a man named Alex Tsipras, who has come to New York a couple of times in the last 2 or 3 years, and if you're around and you hear about him, go listen. He's an interesting and very unusual young man and head of a radical party. And their position is to cancel the debt on the grounds that the debts built up by the Greek government were illegitimate, were not supported by the people, and make it impossible for Greece ever to come out of the disaster that it's in. Well, this economist, Eric Toussaint, makes a wonderful historical point that hadn't occurred to me, should have, but it didn't, and I thought maybe it would be interesting to you. Go back a little bit in history to 1953. 1953, the country we call Germany, at that time West Germany, because the two Germanys had split after World War II. West Germany was, ready, struggling under a mountain of debt. The Hitler regime had built up debt. The war had added to the Germans' debt. And at the end of the war, the Germans discovered that when you're in a large war, it's much better to win than to lose. Because one of the things that happens to you when you lose is that the winners get to blame you for the war. And the reason they're interested in blaming you for the war is they can make you pay for the war, which cost them a lot of money. So the Germans got to pay by a huge debt for the war waged that defeated them. So they got to pay after being defeated for the costs of being defeated. If this sounds strange, welcome to international politics. But at the same time that the successful powers, chiefly the United States, Britain, and France, put this enormous debt on Germany, they had another problem. The problem was that the United States, after World War II, realized that their close buddy and ally, the Soviet Union, in the war against Hitler and Mussolini and Japan, turned out, when you looked a little more closely, not to be a friend. To be, in fact, a mortal enemy. Okay? So we had to shift gears. It was hard for a lot of Americans. It's sort of like watching a player who's always been your favorite, and then realizing, oh no, he's not the favorite, he's the bad guy, and then you have to remember who's got what jersey on, what colors you're... It was a mess for Americans, but thankfully we had a government and a big business community that really went to work to clear that up for us, so we could understand who the enemy was. The enemy was the Soviet Union. And what's near the Soviet Union? Germany. And it wouldn't be a good idea, with a Germany already split east and west, if the Germany was in terrible trouble, suffering, staying in poverty because they had to pay a debt. That wouldn't be very smart. That would be weakening a country right on the border with the Soviet Union, which wasn't our goal at all. So in 1953, a conference happened in London. Get ready. And what happened at the conference? France, Britain, and the United States abolished the German debt. Why is this interesting? Because today, when we're talking about Asia, Africa, and Latin America under a terrible burden, this is an unthinkable thought. This is not to be taken seriously. This is a weird and wild idea. You could never have... We did it. We did it. We did it. If I had time, I'd go through all the conditions of the Germans were allowed to do all kinds of things. Not only did they pay much of their debt was simply forgiven, but they were allowed, for example, to pay their debt in their own currency. At that time, the Deutschmark, the German mark. Whereas today, the International Monetary Fund requires third world countries to pay in what's called hard currency. Swiss francs, euros, dollars, Japanese yen, but not their own currency, because nobody wants to take the chance. Germany's currency was a very sometimes thing, but in order to help them, well, the story is simple, right? When it was important for the United States to have a strong bulwark against the Soviet Union, all the things that are now unthinkable turned out to be not only thinkable, doable, and they were done. It's a very useful thing to think about. And while I'm on the condition of Germany, I didn't know